Socialism comes to New York City in the form of a charismatic but inexperienced 34-year-old who promises New Yorkers free buses, childcare, and a whole lot more. What could possibly go wrong? Today I have a very special guest who knows a great deal about socialism and its ramifications. We will discuss what Mamdani's election means and why it impacts America's future far beyond the city limits of New York. I want to set the stage on how Mamdani was elected and who supports him so that we can understand this as we go into the conversation. It was young people, particularly young women, and foreign-born New Yorkers who pushed Mamdani over the edge. Mamdani earned the vote of only 38% of native New Yorkers. He got 85% of foreign-born who arrived in the past 5 years, though, which is very fascinating. Based on age and gender, 84% of women aged 18 to 29 voted for Mamdani, along with 68% of men in the same age range. He also got the vote of 65% of millennial women and 66% of millennial men. This was a pattern not only in New York, but in all of the elections this year, particularly young women voting overwhelmingly for the left. This election showed that Gen Z and millennials seem to be falling for the socialist trap. On top of this, the most recent poll conducted by the Cato Institute and YouGov found that 62% of Americans under 30 hold a favorable view of socialism. And it gets worse, 34% of them hold a favorable view of communism. This one did not ask if people could define socialism, but they all agreed that capitalism was very bad. With that, I want to bring in the first ever guest on Restoring America with Grace Reilly, the one and only Paul Kengor. This was the only thing I possibly could have done for having the first guest. He is not only a friend, a mentor, but he is also my co-host over at the American Spectator for the Weekend Spectator, our podcast there, where he's also the editor, and he is a professor at Grove City College, my alma mater, the senior director of IFF, and you just can't get into enough of his accolades, seriously. He's also an expert on Marxism and Reagan, and he is the perfect person to have on today on this topic. So Paul, it is so amazing to welcome you on as the first guest. I wouldn't have it any other way.
Great and gracious Grace, I am honored. I am not worthy of this. So this is fantastic. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm so happy to have you. I feel the same way. It's just so great to work with you. And to have you on today, we're going to get right into it. So Reagan obviously said that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Of course, Mamdani did say these words just the other day. Let's watch this clip.
"We will prove that there is no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about."
Amazing.
Yeah, amazing is right. I want to start with what you think about this. What's your reaction?
I was floored. So I heard that when I was in the car driving to Grove City College to teach my 1 o'clock class, my comparative politics class where we talk about all this stuff. And I mean, the distance between that and Ronald Reagan's inaugural address, January 20th, 1981, where he said government is not the solution, government is the problem, is enormous. But what you see there, Grace, is you see the faith of the true believer, right? There is no problem that government cannot solve, right? You cannot have a problem too big that government can't fix. That's really, it's what Hayek and others call, the fatal conceit, right? It's the idea that so many of these guys out of these graduate schools and in places like New York think, well, if you just give us the power, right? If you just elect us, the problem isn't socialism. The problem isn't big government. The problem is you folks for not giving us enough power, right? Not trusting us. If you could just give us more power and, as Reagan said, let the planners plan, let the managers manage. We can solve every problem from womb to tomb, right? There is no problem that we cannot solve. So it's just classic. And I think of the naive fools, people duped into the people applauding. They're like, oh, know. That's dangerous. That's the kind of thing that deludes people, and frankly, on a more practical level, just bankrupts cities. But I guess they're going to have to learn that the hard way.
Yeah, and of course it's worked nowhere. That's the whole entire point there. And I wonder what you think about some of the numbers that I'd read before. So a lot of young people seem to be falling for this Marxist trap. A lot of young people were not only excited about Mamdani and voting for him, but beyond that, obviously there's polling that for years, but now the most recent ones confirm it, showing that young people are supporting socialism more and more. What do you think of that? I think some of them just don't know what it is, so they're more susceptible to these free things promises. But some, I think, through the school system, are just misinformed about the dangers of it. What are your thoughts?
Well, you're right. I mean, people are misinformed about it. They don't know about it. In fact, so according to Marxist-Leninist theory, according to Marx, according to Engels, in fact, even the Democratic Socialists of America, if you go to their website, and that's the group of Zohran Mamdani, they call themselves the largest socialist organization in the United States. And they all say that, in fact, Merriam-Webster even says, if you look it up online, that socialism is about common ownership of the means of production. And Mamdani has actually used that phrase, right? Mm-hmm. Common ownership of the means of production, abolition of private property. But according to Marxist theory, Marxist-Leninist theory, so socialism would eventually lead to communism. Socialism is the final transitionary step to communism. But if you ask most young people, they define socialism, and in fact, the polls like that, Grace, over the years, the best polls will say, okay, you say you support socialism, you say you support communism, now define it. And that's what's much more illuminating, right? They don't say, well, like it says in the Communist Manifesto, abolition of private property, right? The entire communist theory may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. I want to do that. Or abolition of the family, exclamation mark. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists that Marx and Engels wrote. I want to do that. No, if you ask them, they'll say, well, if you look at the Communist Manifesto, it talks about sharing, redistribution. And I would tell people watching, go to an electronic copy of the Communist Manifesto online and see how often words like sharing or neighbor or love or even redistribute pop up. And then compare it to the number of times that words like abolish, abolition, criticize, criticism come up. You'll find out that it's the latter by factors of like 10. So, I mean, and I should say here, this provides hope, really, and you and I have talked about this so many times, Grace, that if we can at least inform them of what the ideology really is, what it really teaches and preaches, get them to actually read about it, and then study through historical examples the actual effects, there might be some hope, because then, better informed, they won't be as ignorant, and I don't think they'd be as inclined to support it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Do you have any thoughts on what the most effective approach is to talking to people who are maybe leaning more towards Marxism, who think someone like Mamdani sounds good and is offering all these free things? What would you say is the best way to help them to understand that that's not really the reality of what will happen with those policies?
Yeah, frankly, shows like this. Podcasts like this, groups like Restoration. I mean, you have to teach the generation, the current generation, what they haven't been taught. And I mean, one of my all-time favorite or really infamous polls, it was done maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I think, Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And it asked people, who's responsible for the deaths of more people, George W. Bush or Joseph Stalin? And I shouldn't laugh, right? But the number of people that said Bush was staggering. And it wasn't just millennials at that point. It was like people over the age of 50. So, I mean, this miseducation has been going on in our colleges for over 50 years now. So the answer to this, the remedy to this is not the government, Mamdani, right? But education through shows like this. They simply have to be taught. And to bring this back to Ronald Reagan always said that if the American people have great common sense, and if you just present them with the facts, Reagan believed that they would pick the truth over and over and over again, the majority of the time. So I think that's our task, is to provide them with accurate information and teach them the truth.
Yeah, I think that is so well said. I couldn't have said it better. And just to round it out, looking at New York, what are your thoughts on how this is impactful beyond New York, and just what this tells us about Marxism and the support that it's getting across America?
Well, I think it tells us more about New York than anything else, right? I mean, you're not going to see a socialist get elected in my hometown of Grove City, Pennsylvania.
Or Florida.
Or Florida, right? I mean, this is what's going on the left coast, on the East Coast, in the big cities. I mean, look at Chicago, what a mess Chicago is. Communist Party, the American Communist Party was founded in Chicago in September 1919, and then it moved to New York. You look at cities like Portland and Seattle. That's where this is happening. And I know a lot of people say, "Well, good, this is what they voted for. Let them bear the consequences." I'd like to see that, but oftentimes, Grace, they don't even learn the lessons. They refuse to accept responsibility, right? So if this bankrupts New York in 3 or 4 years, and the government stores, if they're ever created, are these massive boondoggles, they'll find a way to blame it on Trump, right? Or blame it on the rich.
Or say there wasn't enough socialism. You needed just a little more to fix it.
That's exactly right. You just haven't given us enough power and enough of your tax dollars. It's the problem of you, greedy people. You did this, and that's the faith of the true believer. As Ronald Reagan said, "Well, Marxism, Leninism, that religion of theirs," right? There it is again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Paul, it has been such a pleasure to have you on as the first guest on Restoring America. People can find you, obviously.
Not worthy.
Not even true at all. This was the only first guest that I could have possibly had. But people can find you at spectator.org. Obviously, you're the editor over at the American Spectator. But also, obviously, check out what you can see on the screen, faithandfreedom.com, IFF. Paul and I's podcast, The Week at Spectator, which you can see posted every other weekend over at American Spectator. Any closing notes there?
No, other than I'll repeat my slogan: educate, educate, educate. And that's what podcasts like this need to do. And frankly, I think it's perfect that in your inaugural podcast here, you're tackling this issue, because this is a fight worth having. And like Ronald Reagan said, every generation has to fight for freedom anew. And we have to too. Your generation does too.
Absolutely. So well said. Thank you so much, Paul. It's been great to have you.
Grazie, Grace. God bless.
And I should have mentioned, you can go check out his latest article on this topic from the American Spectator, titled "New Yorkers Elect Another Commie Mayor," and he talks about Bill de Blasio in this. Really interesting, so go check that out. It's on your screen. But beyond this, I have to tell you, I use Paul Kengor's books on Marxism all of the time. They have been such a vital resource for me, so I can't recommend them enough. Even I have a few on the desk. This one on communism, it's super fun and easy to read, but in this book includes what he mentioned, that stat about George W. Bush and Stalin, that absurd thing that exposes the horrors of failure in the education system. So I definitely recommend looking into him and all of the work that he does. Really great. But just to kind of round this episode out, I think what he said is really the point. Education is the only hope, and it's our responsibility as Americans. We have this opportunity that if people don't actually understand what socialism is, that means that there's hope to convince them, hopefully, that it will not create a better life for them. Because it's not like we have a bunch of young, very overt, convinced Marxists running around. I think that's the case sometimes, sure. But I think in large part, we're seeing a lot of people who don't really understand the history of Marxism, socialism, what the connection between socialism and communism is, as Paul Kengor got into a few moments ago. But I think making sure that we're talking about the basics, the why, that's the way that hopefully we can change more hearts and minds. And I really do think that there's hope of that. Because ultimately, as conservatives, we are standing for our positions, our free market positions, because we believe and we know that they will provide a better life for all of us. Same thing with the big government point that we started with. As conservatives, we believe that limited government gives more autonomy to the people. It gives us all more money in our pockets. It gives us more freedom. It allows states, cities, societies to be run more effectively, where you don't have the chaos that we've seen in New York, because something that is a good point is how unaffordable New York is, and government involvement makes that worse. The taxation makes that worse. These leftist policies all contribute to that. Even the fact that what's really interesting is that there's about 53% of New Yorkers who are on some form or another of a public benefit. So some form, about half of New Yorkers getting government help from something. So in New York, there's this dependence that's been created, and now it's just kind of solidified, where so many people are depending on the government. So it isn't much of a surprise, I don't think, that the demographic there and so many young people would hear these promises of affordability and free things and say, oh, that sounds great, that's what I want. But as conservatives, our responsibility is to explain why those free things are not actually possible. It's a utopia that doesn't exist with the leftist socialist policies that are being proposed. So I think that really was such a great point. All of the points were great, but that's the best one, that we should be talking more about the why, about the basics, and about why conservative positions will create better, more affordable, more free lives for everyone involved at all different levels, no matter what economic standing you may fall into. The election of Zohran Mamdani as the mayor of the largest city in America, the financial capital of the United States and arguably the world, ought to be a wake-up call for patriots all across America, because, to paraphrase an iconic New York song made famous by Frank Sinatra, my favorite, if a socialist candidate can make it here, they can make it anywhere. And that should frighten all freedom-loving Americans. Of course, it's true that right now this is New York, as Paul mentioned, that we're commenting on. But I think with more widespread support, especially from young people, it does make it so that we're not immune from these ideas permeating further. So I think as patriots, we've got to be awake to this, paying attention, and that's why this issue matters so much. Thank you so much for joining us on Restoring America. Be sure to subscribe, like, and leave us 5 stars to help support the show, and so that you can keep up to date on each episode. You can find us on all social media platforms at the handles listed on the screen. This show is powered by the amazing Restoration of America. Be sure to go to restorationofamerica.com for much more, and I will see you next time.